The stagecoach lurched violently over another rut in the endless prairie road, and Sarah Mitchell gripped the worn leather seat until her knuckles turned white. Dust swirled through the gaps in the wooden frame, coating her dark traveling dress in a fine layer of grit that made her look like she'd aged a decade in the 3 weeks since leaving Boston. She was 23 years old, educated at a proper finishing school, and absolutely terrified of what awaited her at the end of this bone-rattling journey. The advertisement had seemed like Providence when she'd found it tucked between the pages of a discarded newspaper at the boarding house where she worked 16-hour days for barely enough to afford a shared room and one meal. Respectable gentleman seeks virtuous wife for ranch in Dakota Territory. Must be willing to embrace frontier life. Room, board, and security guaranteed. She'd written immediately, her cramped handwriting betraying the desperation she'd tried so hard to hide. Within 2 weeks, she had a response, travel money, and a one-way ticket to a town called Redemption Falls. But the stagecoach driver had other plans. His name was Dutch, a weathered man whose face looked like cracked leather left too long in the sun. That morning, he'd announced a detour with the casual indifference of someone commenting on the weather. Indian trouble on the main road, he'd said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. We're taking the northern route through Lakota Territory. Should add only a day or two. Sarah's fellow passenger, a whiskey trader named Garrett, had gone pale. That's madness, he'd hissed. The Lakota don't take kindly to trespassers. They'll scalp us before we can say our prayers. Dutch had simply shrugged and snapped the reins, sending the horses into motion before anyone could protest further. Now, as the sun climbed toward its zenith, Sarah watched the landscape transform. The gentle rolling hills gave way to more rugged terrain, dotted with strange rock formations that jutted from the earth like ancient teeth. The prairie grass grew taller here, rippling in waves that seemed to whisper warnings she couldn't quite understand. She'd never felt so small, so utterly removed from everything familiar and safe. Garrett hadn't stopped talking since they'd entered what he called hostile territory. He recited every gruesome story he'd ever heard about Indian raids, his voice rising with each tale until Sarah wanted to scream at him to shut his mouth. She understood his fear because she felt it too, but giving voice to it only made the dread worse. It settled in her stomach like a stone, heavy and cold. The attack, when it came, was nothing like Garrett's hysterical predictions. There were no war cries, no dramatic charge across the plains. One moment the stagecoach was rolling through a narrow pass between two hills, and the next, riders appeared on both ridges as if they'd materialized from the earth itself. They sat astride painted horses, their silhouettes sharp against the brilliant blue sky. Sarah counted 12, then 15, then stopped counting because her heart was hammering too hard to focus. Dutch hauled on the reins with a curse, and the stagecoach shuddered to a stop. Garrett fumbled for a pistol he'd kept hidden beneath his coat, but Dutch's meaty hand clamped down on his wrist. "You fire that weapon, and we're all dead," he growled. "Sit still and let me talk." But there would be no talking. The riders descended the hills with practiced ease, surrounding the stagecoach in a circle that tightened like a noose. Sarah forced herself to look at them, really look, instead of staring at her trembling hands. They were young and old, their faces painted with striking designs in red and black. They carried rifles, bows, lances decorated with feathers that danced in the wind. Their eyes held no mercy, but neither did they hold the savage bloodlust Garrett had described. They looked at the stagecoach the way a rancher might look at a coyote in his henhouse, with cold calculation and justified anger. One rider moved forward from the circle, and Sarah's breath caught. He sat taller than the others, his bearing radiating authority that needed no announcement. His chest was bare except for a breastplate made of what looked like bone, and his long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers that marked him as someone of great importance. When his dark eyes swept over the stagecoach and landed on Sarah through the open window, she felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. The chief had found them, and their fate now rested in his hands. The chief spoke a single word in Lakota, sharp and commanding, and his warriors moved with synchronized precision. Rough hands yanked open the stagecoach door, dragging Garrett out first. He stumbled into the dust, still clutching uselessly at his concealed pistol. Dutch followed with more dignity, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that came too late to matter. When a warrior reached for Sarah, she climbed out on her own, refusing to be pulled like a sack of grain. Her legs shook beneath her skirts, but she kept her chin up, a stubborn habit her mother had drilled into her since childhood. "Please," Dutch started, his voice cracking with fear he'd hidden until now. "We mean no harm. We're just passing through to Redemption Falls. We didn't know this was restricted territory." The chief regarded him with an expression that could have been carved from stone. He spoke again in Lakota, his voice carrying across the prairie with natural authority. An older warrior with gray streaking through his braided hair translated, his English surprisingly fluent though heavily accented. "You knew," the translator said flatly. "All white men know these lands are ours by treaty. Yet you come anyway, like water flowing where it should not go. You bring whiskey to poison our young men. You bring diseases that kill our children. You bring promises written on paper that blow away like smoke." His eyes fixed on Garrett with particular contempt. "We know what you carry in those barrels, whiskey trader. We can smell the poison from here." Garrett's face flushed red, then drained white. "It's just trade goods," he stammered. "Legitimate business. I have papers, licenses from the territorial governor." The translator didn't bother relaying this to the chief, who had already dismissed Garrett with a glance and turned his attention to Sarah. She felt those dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He said something in Lakota, a question based on the rising inflection at the end. "The chief asks why a woman travels alone to this hard country," the translator said. "He asks what drives you from your home." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry as the dust coating her dress. She could lie, but something in the chief's gaze suggested he would know. Besides, what did it matter now? If they were going to kill her, the truth wouldn't make it worse. "I'm traveling to meet my betrothed," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "A rancher in Redemption Falls. I'm to be his wife." The chief's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been curiosity or might have been contempt. He spoke again, longer this time, and the translator's weathered face creased with what looked like pity. "The chief says you travel far to give yourself to a stranger. He says this is the way of desperate people, of those with no other path. He asks if you go willingly or if you are traded like his people trade horses." The question struck Sarah like a slap. Was there really a difference? She'd sold herself to escape poverty and loneliness, packaged her future in a letter to a man whose face she'd never seen. But willingly? She'd chosen this path from a list of terrible options, which seemed like the thinnest definition of willing. "I go of my own choice," she said quietly. "I go to make a new life because my old one offered nothing but hardship." For the first time, something flickered in the chief's eyes. Not sympathy exactly, but perhaps understanding. He nodded slowly, then issued a series of commands that sent his warriors into swift action. They pulled Dutch and Garrett away from the stagecoach, binding their hands with leather thongs. The whiskey barrels were dragged from the storage compartment and smashed open with rifle butts, the amber liquid soaking into the thirsty earth. Garrett screamed protests that earned him a blow to the stomach that doubled him over, gasping. Dutch stayed silent, which seemed the wiser choice. Sarah stood frozen, waiting to be bound as well, but the warriors left her untouched. Instead, the chief dismounted in one fluid motion and approached her directly. Up close, he was even more imposing. He stood well over 6 feet, his shoulders broad and his movements carrying the controlled power of a predator. Scars crossed his chest and arms, pale lines against copper skin that told stories of battles survived. He circled her slowly, studying her the way one might study a horse before purchase. Sarah forced herself to remain still, to meet his eyes when they returned to her face. He spoke directly to her this time, not bothering with the translator, as if testing whether she would understand. She didn't, but she heard the question in his tone. "She doesn't speak our language," the translator said, stepping closer. "The chief says you are not like the other white women who come to this territory. You do not scream or faint. You do not beg. He finds this interesting." Sarah wasn't sure if interesting was good or bad in this context. "What will happen to us?" she asked, directing the question to the translator but keeping her eyes on the chief. "The men will be released at the edge of our territory with a warning never to return. You," the translator paused, glancing at the chief who nodded permission to continue, "you will come with us. The chief has decided this." Terror and confusion warred in Sarah's chest. "Why? I've done nothing wrong. I'm just a passenger." The chief spoke again, his tone firm but not cruel. The translator's expression remained carefully neutral as he relayed the words. "The chief says the spirits have sent you to our land for a reason. He says you seek a new life, and perhaps you will find it among the Lakota people. He says you will not be harmed if you do not fight. You will be treated with honor. But you will come." It wasn't a request. It was a declaration as absolute as the sky above them. The Lakota village sprawled across a river valley like something from a dream Sarah's mind couldn't quite accept as real. Dozens of teepees formed circles within circles, their painted surfaces depicting animals and symbols she didn't understand. Smoke rose from cooking fires, carrying the scent of roasting meat and herbs. Children played between the lodges, their laughter ringing out with a joy that seemed incongruous with the stern warriors who had captured her. Women looked up from their work, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion as the chief rode into camp with Sarah seated before him on his painted horse. She'd been terrified when he'd lifted her onto the animal without asking, his hands firm but not rough. The 2-day journey to the village had passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. She'd slept fitfully at night, wrapped in a blanket the chief had provided, always aware of the warriors keeping watch. They'd fed her dried meat and something like bread made from roots, and though her stomach had rebelled at first, hunger had eventually won. The chief himself had barely spoken, communicating through gestures and the translator when necessary. Now, as they entered his world, Sarah saw him transform. The stern warrior who'd captured her became something more, a leader greeted with obvious respect and affection. People called out to him, and he responded with words that made them smile or nod seriously. Children ran alongside his horse, laughing and reaching up to touch his leg. An elderly woman with a face like carved mahogany approached, speaking rapidly in Lakota while her sharp eyes assessed Sarah with clear disapproval. The chief dismounted and helped Sarah down with unexpected gentleness, then engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion with the old woman. Sarah caught the word washichu repeated several times, spoken like a curse. The translator, who'd ridden with them, leaned close to Sarah. Washichu means white person, he explained quietly. The chief's grandmother does not approve of bringing you here. She lost 2 sons to white man's bullets. Her grief makes her hard. Sarah's heart sank. She was beginning to understand the impossible situation she'd landed in. These people had every reason to hate her, to see her as representing everything that threatened their way of life. Yet the chief had brought her here, claiming the spirits had sent her. What did that even mean? The argument ended with the grandmother stalking away, her back rigid with disapproval. The chief turned to Sarah, and for the first time, she saw something in his expression that might have been weariness. He spoke, and the translator conveyed his words. The chief says you will stay in his lodge. His sister will teach you our ways. You will work alongside the women, learn our language, understand our customs. He asks if you will try to escape. Sarah considered lying but decided against it. Where would I go? I have no horse, no supplies, no knowledge of this land. I wouldn't survive a day alone out there. The chief nodded, seeming satisfied with this practical assessment. Then we understand each other. You are here. Make the best of here. The chief's sister, Winona, appeared like a spirit materializing from smoke. She was younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps 19 or 20, with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief. Unlike her grandmother, Winona seemed delighted by Sarah's presence. She took Sarah's hand without hesitation, chattering in Lakota so rapidly that the translator struggled to keep up. She says you need a bath and new clothes, he managed. She says you smell like white man's fear and prairie dust. She means no offense. It is simply truth. The women's bathing area was a secluded bend in the river, screened by willows that whispered in the breeze. Sarah had never bathed in front of others before, had been raised to consider the body something shameful that must be hidden. But the Lakota women shed their clothes with unself-conscious ease, wading into the clear water with laughter and conversation flowing as naturally as the current. Winona tugged at Sarah's dress impatiently, and Sarah realized she had no choice but to adapt or mark herself as strange forever. The water was shockingly cold, stealing her breath when she first stepped in. But it felt glorious after weeks of travel dust, and she scrubbed her skin until it glowed pink. The women watched her with frank curiosity, commenting on her pale skin, her different body shape, her unbound hair that fell past her waist in dark waves. Winona produced what looked like a root and demonstrated how to use it as soap, creating a gentle lather that smelled faintly of herbs. As Sarah washed, she noticed the scars. Nearly every woman bore them, marks of hardship and survival etched into their flesh. A young mother had a puckered scar across her shoulder, clearly from a bullet. An older woman was missing 2 fingers on her left hand. These were not delicate flowers sheltered from life's cruelties. These were warriors in their own right, survivors who'd faced horrors Sarah could only imagine. After bathing, Winona presented Sarah with traditional clothing, a doeskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork and fringe that swayed with movement. It was beautiful and practical, so different from the restrictive corsets and heavy skirts Sarah was accustomed to. Winona helped her dress, then set about braiding Sarah's hair in the Lakota style, weaving in small ornaments that caught the light. When Sarah caught her reflection in the still water, she barely recognized herself. That evening, Sarah sat in the chief's teepee, which was larger and more ornately decorated than the others. The chief's name, she'd learned, was Thaswenki Kinyang, which meant running horse, though the translator said he was called Chief Kinyang for short. He sat across the fire from her, engaged in conversation with several elder men who'd come to discuss matters of the tribe. Sarah didn't understand the words, but she understood the gravity of their expressions, the weight of decisions being made. Winona brought food, a stew rich with meat and vegetables that tasted better than anything Sarah had eaten in months. She ate slowly, aware of eyes watching her, judging whether she would adapt or wither. After the elders left, Chief Kinyang finally addressed her directly through Winona, who'd apparently decided to become Sarah's personal translator and guide. "My brother asks if you are afraid," Winona said, her English surprisingly good now that she chose to use it. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Yes," she admitted. "But I was afraid before too. I've been afraid for a long time." Chief Kinyang nodded slowly, his dark eyes reflecting firelight. He spoke again, and Winona smiled as she translated. "He says fear is honest. Fear keeps us alive. It is the lack of fear that kills. He says you may stay as long as you wish to learn our ways. If you prove worthy, you may become one of us. If not, you will be returned to your people when the seasons change." It was more mercy than Sarah had expected, more opportunity than she'd had in years. In that moment, sitting in a teepee in Lakota territory, Sarah Mitchell made a choice. She would not just survive here. She would become someone new. Winter arrived on the plains like an invading army, transforming the landscape into a realm of white silence and bitter wind that cut through even the warmest furs. Sarah had been with the Lakota for 4 months, and the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach seemed like a stranger from another lifetime. Her hands, once soft and suited only for needlework and piano keys, now bore calluses from tanning hides, gathering firewood, and helping construct winter lodges. Her skin had darkened from endless days working outdoors, and her body had grown lean and strong from the constant physical labor. Language had been her first real challenge. Lakota bore no resemblance to English, with sounds that seemed to come from the throat and chest in ways her Boston accent had never prepared her for. But Winona proved to be a patient teacher, pointing at objects and repeating their names until Sarah's tongue learned new shapes. The verbs came harder, with their complex conjugations and subtle meaning shifts that could change an entire sentence's intent. Sarah made mistakes that sent children into fits of giggles, calling a buffalo a sacred dog and accidentally proposing marriage when she meant to ask for water. But slowly, painfully, the language began to make sense. She started to hear patterns in the conversations flowing around her, to recognize words and phrases. The day she successfully told a story in Lakota to a group of children, seeing their eyes light up with understanding and delight, she felt a pride that no accomplishment in Boston had ever produced. Chief Kinyang had been present, sitting at the edge of the circle, and when she'd finished, he'd nodded approval. That small gesture had warmed her more than the fire. The chief himself remained a mystery wrapped in silence. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words carried the weight of careful thought. Sarah learned his history in pieces, gathered from Winona's stories and the translator's occasional explanations. Kinyang had lost his wife 3 years earlier during a difficult childbirth that claimed both mother and child. The grief had nearly destroyed him, Winona confided, turning him into a man of stone who threw himself into warfare and leadership with reckless intensity. Only time and his grandmother's stern guidance had brought him back from that dark edge. He watched Sarah, though. She felt his gaze tracking her progress as she learned to prepare hides, to cook traditional meals, to identify medicinal plants and understand their uses. The Lakota women had become her teachers, their initial suspicion gradually giving way to cautious acceptance. She worked harder than necessary, driven by a need to prove herself worthy of the space she occupied in their world. When other women rested, she continued. When tasks were difficult, she persisted until her muscles screamed. One evening, as Sarah struggled to repair a torn moccasin by firelight, Chief Kinyang sat beside her. His proximity made her hands tremble slightly, though she couldn't have said whether from nervousness or something else. He reached out, his large hand covering hers, stilling her fumbling fingers. Then, with surprising gentleness, he showed her the proper way to make the stitches, demonstrating the technique with patient precision. His hands were scarred from countless battles, but they moved with practiced grace through the delicate work. "You try too hard," he said in English, startling her. She hadn't known he spoke her language. "You try to become Lakota in 1 season. This is not possible. Even Lakota spend lifetime becoming Lakota." His voice was deep and resonant, carrying an accent that made the words sound like music. Sarah set down the moccasin, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in weeks. "I'm trying to earn my place here," she said quietly. I'm trying to prove I'm not just another Washichu who sees your people as obstacles or savages. Qin Yang studied her face in the firelight, his expression unreadable. You prove this already, he said. You stay when you could run. You work when you could complain. You learn when you could refuse. The women, they talk about you. They say the white woman has strong spirit. This is good. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of mutual respect that felt both terrifying and thrilling. Why did you bring me here? Sarah asked, the question that had burned in her chest for months finally escaping. You could have sent me away with the men. Why keep me? The chief was silent for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if pulled from some deep well of memory. That day, when we stopped your wagon, I see you standing in dust. You are afraid, yes, but you do not hide. You look at me like I am man, not monster. Most white women, they scream or faint or close their eyes. You see me. He paused, poking at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. My grandmother, she say Lakota people are dying. White man takes land, kills buffalo, breaks treaties. She say we will disappear like smoke. But I think, maybe understanding can grow even in hard soil. Maybe if one white woman can learn our ways, can see we are human like her, maybe there is hope. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the responsibility he placed on her shoulders without her knowledge. That's a heavy burden to carry, she whispered. Qin Yang's smile was sad and ancient. All burdens are heavy. We carry them anyway. As winter deepened, Sarah found her place in the daily rhythms of camp life. She learned to read weather signs in the sky and animal behavior, to predict storms and cold snaps. She discovered she had a talent for working with herbs and medicines, and the tribe's healer, an ancient woman named Tehienkalawieng, took her on as an informal apprentice. The physical closeness of teepee living had shocked her initially. In Boston, propriety demanded distance and privacy. Here, families slept side by side, sharing warmth and space without the shame she'd been taught to feel about bodies and proximity. She'd grown accustomed to sleeping in Chief Qin Yang's teepee, separated from him by the fire but aware of his presence through the long dark nights. Sometimes she would wake to find him already up, sitting in meditation or preparing for the day, and those quiet dawn moments became precious to her. The turning point came during a fierce blizzard that trapped the camp for 3 days. Supplies ran low, and several children fell ill with fever. Sarah worked alongside Tehienkalawieng for hours, brewing teas and applying poultices, singing soft songs to comfort crying babies. On the second night, exhausted and worried, she fell asleep beside a sick child she'd been tending, her hand still resting on the little girl's fevered forehead. She woke to find Chief Qin Yang carrying her back to his teepee, the child's crisis having passed. You cannot heal others if you do not rest, he said softly, laying her on her sleeping furs with unexpected tenderness. Sarah looked up at him through exhausted eyes and saw something in his face that made her breath catch. It wasn't pity or even gratitude. It was recognition. He saw her, truly saw her, the same way she'd seen him that first day. And in that moment, everything changed. Spring arrived like a promise kept, melting snow revealing earth that seemed to pulse with renewed life. The buffalo herds began their migration, and the camp buzzed with preparations for the hunt. Sarah had survived her first winter with the Lakota, and she'd done more than survive, she'd transformed. The frightened mail-order bride who traveled west seeking security in a stranger's arms no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who could tan a hide, speak Lakota with near fluency, identify medicinal plants, and command respect through her tireless work and genuine desire to understand. But with spring came a choice she could no longer avoid. Chief Qin Yang approached her one morning as she worked on beadwork outside the teepee. He sat beside her in comfortable silence for a moment before speaking. The snows have melted, he said in Lakota, a language that now felt as natural to her as English. The passes are clear. If you wish to return to the white world, to find the rancher who waits for you, I will provide horses and guides to take you safely. Sarah's hands stilled on the beadwork, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd known this moment would come, had felt it approaching with the changing seasons. The rancher in Redemption Falls probably thought her dead, killed by Indians or lost to the harsh prairie. Her old life waited like an unfulfilled contract, a promise made by a different woman in a different time. And if I choose to stay? She asked quietly, not looking at him. Qin Yang's silence stretched long enough that she finally raised her eyes to his face. What she saw there took her breath away. The stoic chief who rarely showed emotion looked at her with an intensity that seemed to burn. If you stay, he said carefully, you cannot be between two worlds. You must choose to be Lakota, to accept our ways fully, to understand that the path will be hard. The white soldiers come more each season. War may come. Hardship will come. If you stay knowing this. And would I stay as a guest? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Or as something more? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications and unspoken feelings that had grown over months of shared space and mutual respect. King Yang reached out, his fingers gently touching her cheek in a gesture so tender it made her eyes sting with tears. I am chief, he said softly. My duty is to my people always. But I am also man, and this man has come to see you not as white woman or guest or curiosity. I see Sarah who works until her hands bleed. Sarah who laughs with children and learns from grandmothers. Sarah who has courage to become new person. If you stay, I would ask you to be my wife, to stand beside me as partner, to help me lead our people through the dark times coming. It was not the romantic proposal Sarah had once dreamed of in her Boston boarding house, full of flowery words and promises of easy comfort. It was something far more real and far more precious, an acknowledgement of who she'd become and an invitation to face an uncertain future together. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that matched her own. I choose to stay, she said firmly. I choose this life, this people, this path. And I choose you. The wedding ceremony was held when the moon was full, combining Lakota traditions with Sarah's desire to honor both her past and her future. She wore white doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork that the women of the tribe had created together, each stitch representing their acceptance of her. Winona had woven wildflowers into her hair, and Tehiankala Wieng had blessed her with sage smoke, pronouncing her ready to join with the chief. Even King Yang's grandmother had softened, grudgingly admitting that Sarah had proven herself worthy. You work hard, the old woman had said in her limited English. You respect our ways. You love my grandson with good heart. This is enough. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. They stood before the tribe as King Yang pledged to protect and honor her, and she pledged to stand beside him in all things. They shared sacred herbs and spoke vows in Lakota, binding themselves together in the presence of the spirits and the community. That night, in the privacy of their teepee, King Yang held her close and spoke words he'd clearly been saving. I was dead inside when you came, he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. My wife's death broke something in me. I thought I would never feel warmth again. But you, with your stubborn courage and your refusal to give up, you brought light back into dark places. You are a gift from the spirits, even if you came in strange way. Sarah pressed her face against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her cheek. I was lost when that stagecoach stopped, she whispered. I was going to marry a stranger because I saw no other path. But the spirits, they knew better. They brought me to you, to this life, to the home I was always meant to find. The years that followed were not easy, as King Yang had warned. The white expansion continued relentlessly, pushing the Lakota from their traditional lands, breaking treaties, bringing conflict and sorrow. Sarah used her unique position to serve as a bridge when possible, translating not just language but culture and intention, helping both sides see the humanity in the other. It was exhausting, often heartbreaking work, but she persisted. She bore King Yang 3 children, each one a symbol of 2 worlds joining. She taught them Lakota ways while also teaching them English, preparing them to navigate a future that would demand fluency in both cultures. She watched her husband lead with wisdom and strength through impossible circumstances, and she stood beside him through every trial, her love deepening with each shared hardship. When visitors from the white world occasionally passed through, bringing news from Redemption Falls, Sarah would sometimes think about the rancher who'd sent for a mail-order bride who never arrived. She hoped he'd found happiness with someone else, someone who could have given him the simple, conventional life he'd sought. That woman had never truly existed anyway. On quiet evenings, when the children slept and she sat beside King Yang watching the fire, Sarah would remember the terrified girl on that stagecoach, traveling toward a life of security and emptiness. That stagecoach detour through Lakota land had seemed like a disaster, a frightening interruption of carefully laid plans. But it had been the greatest gift of her life, a chance to discover who she really was, what she was truly capable of, and where she genuinely belonged. Chief King Yang had made Lakota land her home, yes. But more than that, he'd helped her make herself her home, comfortable in her own skin, confident in her choices, complete in ways she'd never imagined possible. The mail-order bride had wandered into Lakota land and found not just a husband, but a purpose, a people, and herself. And that, Sarah knew with absolute certainty, was worth every risk, every fear, and every moment of the remarkable journey that had brought her there.